All of y'all can hear me, right? Yes, good, thumbs up, other signs that people like to get in trouble with the ADL or whatever. Wonderful. Okay, absolutely. Good to see you all. It's nice to be up here once again and encouraging myself once again in the tradition of speaking extemporaneously. As Winston Churchill once famously remarked, allow me to prepare my impromptu remarks. I'm very, again, thankful to be up here speaking. I'm very thankful to be part of the Old Glory Club and to meet so many amazing individuals all across the country and people who share a like mind and a similar interest and wanting to make sense of the world around us and wanting to actually do something. As Red Hawk said last night, the theme of last year's event was taking the reins. What can we do to secure ourselves in a position so that one day we may act? Of course, as he had mentioned, that was in the wake of the 2024 election, and now afterwards we stand here wondering what is the road ahead of us. Are we suddenly back? Is based world upon us? Are we going to do something that will truly make the country great again, or are we ready to cope our way for the next 4 years just as we had done with the first Trump administration? Well, regardless of which, I think it is very glad that Dave spoke first last night, giving us this warm and heartfelt motivational speech, telling us that our victory is inevitable. It was a great way to end the night after long hours of travel and sleepless nights, getting ready to be here. And I'm sorry for everyone, I am not here to motivate you today, and in fact, I take great pleasure getting to follow Dave because I get to talk about everyone's favorite tradition, collapse. It is very well established in the Anglo-American tradition that we are probably the most eschatologically focused people on the face of the earth. Well, more importantly, I would say most of Western kind, but mainly right now with us, the Anglo-American tradition. Post-apocalyptic fiction is a 19th century invention. We have always been wondering how the world will end, especially as we live in the age after the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and making sense of our post-Christian age. The earliest writers included Mary Shelley and numerous others, wondering somehow if the world were to end, then finally, after the last man finally takes his last breath, the dead will finally rise and the book of Revelation will finally begin. These writers range anywhere from both French and English traditions, and in 1826 we find ourselves with a series of sketches and paintings wondering what will the British Empire look like 1,000 years from now, as we look upon it now today, as we once did the records of ancient Rome. We love wondering how things are going to end. We love wondering how bad is it going to be. We love turning to our fictions. We love turning to our scriptures. We love turning to anyone who is willing to offer us an opinion and an idea of just how bad things are going to be. We're well acquainted with them. Even inside our public school districts, we are told all the time about the apocalyptic future, the dystopians that lie ahead of us, and George Orwell's 1984 or Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Well, needless to say, I don't think that we're in any combination of those two, but those are the ones that we are the most familiar with. Others like to cite their more obscure books or reference their friends and their great writing and their great fiction. We are surrounded by great authors in this room by now, whether it be fictional writing or those known for their non-fiction political takes online. However, one gentleman that comes to my mind more than anything that talks about the future of the United States and what we might be in for is a relatively obscure author known by probably most of the people in this room, but if not, I'll be happy to introduce him. Theodore Judson, born in the mid-1950s, is an American writer best known for 2 books, The Martian General's Daughter and, as one of my personal favorites, Fitzpatrick's War. Fitzpatrick's War details a history 500 years in the future, wondering what happened to ancient America and the empire known as the Yukon Confederacy that would emerge from a new agrarian movement and suddenly take over the country, and leading themselves to not only wage war in a way that allows them to reconquer Europe, take over Britain and the Anglosphere, but allow themselves to rule in a world where technology as we know it has failed, and this sort of steampunk, high Episcopalian tradition rules over all. As my friend on Twitter likes to say, the long arc of history may be long, but it leans towards 40K. We're all just picking factions. I disagree with him. The arc of history is long, but I pray to God that it leans towards Fitzpatrick's War. However, Judson describes what the 21st century's crisis that leads to the sort of breakdown of the world as we know it, and writing in a sort of historiographical style of trying to break down what went wrong, looking through the records. He tells us a myriad of things about movements and people trying to make sense as America continues to decline into a low-trust society where no one can trust anybody. He writes, quote, "But not everyone in America was well pleased with this new Jerusalem on earth. And the more the time that this land became richer, the more it resembled a new Nineveh. First, every citizen who had eyes and a mind to examine what he saw lived with certain knowledge that corruption lay upon the land as heavily as fog did upon the New England coast in December. Not only did money change hands in nearly every human relationship, but patronage granted a place for incompetence at every level and at every institution." The journalist Richard Redmond wrote in 2038 that when he built a new home, he had to bribe the municipal authorities to approve his purchase of land, and bribe his county commissioners to approve his construction plans, and bribe the carpenters and the pipe fitters and the unions to hire his contractor workers, and to bribe the architects to create his plans, and bribe the local fire department to protect his house both during and after construction, and bribe the city to provide him with electrical and sewer connections, and had to bribe 7 other entities, including local gangs as well as police forces, on a monthly basis for a space of 10 years, or else his new home would be set afire. The army and the police became mercenary pawns for various political schemes. Sounds kind of familiar, not too far from where we're at. We like to talk about patronage, we like to talk about what's to come, and we like to talk about how the fact that money is the only thing that really gets us anywhere. But furthermore, when we see about how bad things can get, we always ask ourselves, almost as if it's kind of a cope or some kind of prayer that we say to ourselves, surely one day things will get so bad that the people will wake up. Well, Judson continues, for people in his time, he writes that if it ain't broadcast television, they don't want it. As we find ourselves with the inability to maintain our machinery, our electrical systems, our power grids, Americans realized that if they couldn't just have their electricity, they would be happy to just live without it. In our current day, we see this quite often, especially now as the Trump administration brought in 59 white South African refugees. One of the first things that came out of the South African government was an Afrikaner speaking that things were not so bad, that actually we live in a colorblind society in South Africa, and our Constitution ensures that we are supposed to live equally under the law. Yeah, buddy, so does my Constitution. But it does illustrate that no matter how bad things get, people will happily tell themselves that things are fine, that they will delude themselves into thinking that this is how things are going to be. Now, we'll return to Judson in just a minute towards the end of this talk, but I find it important for us to sort of understand that this is what we're looking at towards the future of our political systems. Every single one of you people in here has probably consulted with Spengler or Toynbee or Joseph Tainter or anyone else who has talked about the cycles and nature and collapse of civilization and human relationships. We're all good at it. We all do. A lot of us have gotten our start trying to explain esoteric political philosophy about the rise and fall of institutions. As an aside, the late science fiction writer James Blish, once part of the Futurarians as well as a devout Stalinist in the 1930s, had written shortly before his death in 1972 that science fiction is the ultimate genre of an age that is entering its winter phase of civilization, per the idea of Oswald Spengler. And for that, for a man who was about to die, simply saying, the things that made me rich are a product of a dying Caesarean age, I couldn't imagine a greater black pill to go out on. However, this resorting to fiction, this looking towards our writers, our authors, our scriptures, is innately part of the Anglo-American tradition. And it is part of something that we look to as a way to divinize the future and to make sense of everything. Growing up, I was not really a religious person at all. I had no understanding of Christianity, eschatology, or anything like that. So when we would come back from overseas, when my dad was in the military, I would go visit my grandmother, and I would go read almost every book she had on her bookshelf. Little did I know that I would be reading more or less the entirety of Larry B. Jenkins' Left Behind series. And I thought, good God, we are in for some serious shit. Although I don't think that rapture is going to happen, and I certainly don't think that it's going to be in a way where Nick Cage is going to survive on an airline flight with people disappearing in thin air. We do live in a time where we're so focused on what's going to happen, because as Dave had pointed out recently last night, we all know that something is wrong. And there are a multitude of works that will tell you exactly how, and how the day's age mirrors very closely to the one before us. Professor Timothy Klein writes about this in his well-known book 1177 BC, the year that civilization collapsed. in which the ancient world, describing the Bronze Age collapse, was not only innately globalized at its time, but if we were to look at social networking maps of that era, not one civilization was only 1 degree away from every other civilization in the ancient world. They relied on each other for trade. We know that King Hammurabi did not like Minoan shoes and that he returned them. Sadly, there's not anything in the code of Hammurabi about what to do about bad shoes. However, it tells you what is going on at the world in this time, and that it wasn't just the sea peoples coming in, but it wasn't just famine, it wasn't just fire, it wasn't just drought, it wasn't just the changing of the climate in arable lands, and in fact, as Klein points out, it was all of these things at once. And at every lecture he goes to, he is asked the same question time and time again. Professor Klein, do you really think that something like this could happen today? And he says, yes, it's happening right now. And he looks at it with a smile, knowing that, well, he won't really live to see the end of it all, but nevertheless, when you look at our current situation with climate change, the damage that we have done to our farmlands with industrial-grade farming, our over-reliance on technology in ways that create more and more complex systems that are becoming increasingly difficult to contain, everyone has probably in here read Palladium Magazine's The Competency Crisis. We all get that uneasy feeling when we try and peek inside the cockpit of the plane just to see who's driving. And even today, flying is a bit of a gamble, as we all know, with delays, power outages, fuel, and the rest. But this is not just what's happening in the airlines, but it's not just about dealing with climate change, or however you want to describe it. It also has to come to the fact that we as a people are dealing with our own sea peoples, created by disastrous military adventurism in the Middle East, and the inability for us to even recognize, due to a post-war consensus that says we're not allowed to have nations, that we have allowed ourselves to be invaded both in this country and in everywhere else in Western world, especially in Europe, in the wake of our wars in the Middle East. The sea peoples are already inside the gates. We are now dealing with a collapse of complex systems in a way that would make Joseph Tainter blush. However, as we're talking about taking the reins and moving forward towards a world in which we can somehow win and take it all back, we also have to look at the social pressures of more recent revolutions that had led to the collapse of older and more ancien regimes. Jack Goldstone has a great book published 25 years ago called Revolution and Rebellion in the Early Modern Era, 1600 to 1850. There's a really good chapter on that describing the French Revolution and the social and political pressures that had led to the revolution and the overthrow of the king. One of the things that had struck me the most was that people were dying less. There were more men than ever living in France, despite a declining birth rate well into their 20s and 30s. And they were doing exactly what they were raised to do and doing exactly what they were told to do from their youth up. The way to find social mobility is to chase after jobs and opportunities that may one day lend you a title of nobility that you and your ancestors and your descendants can one day inherit. Sounds like an overproduction of elites, because as thousands and thousands of French young men realized, well, I got my law degree, and now there's no opportunity for me to practice law, let alone become someone who can inherit a title of mobility. Even the French in 1782 realized that there was a sensitive young man problem. With that being said, Goldstone outlines that it's not really an overproduction of elites, but there was no circulation of elites to take place to begin with. As the titles of nobility began to be overinflated, just like our bachelor's and master's degrees in various institutions, that when this happened, the people who already held land, those who already held titles of nobility that would go down to their descendants, began to make it a little harder for anyone else to have access to that title. It became noticeable to the king that if he didn't do something, that problems were going to happen when it came to nobility. So he began to create new titles, new positions, new HR managers, new product managers, if you will, that may one day give you the chance to inherit a title of nobility for you and your descendants to enjoy and to be a lord over something. But we know the story of how that ends. We know how that took place, because eventually it was not enough. Famine hit the land, and hundreds of thousands of young Frenchmen who had to leave the rural countryside because there was no work to do, hoping to get a job in university and to get a law degree, would rise up, behead the king, and destroy one of the greatest European civilizations that had ever existed due to poor management and an overproduction of elites, those who demanded themselves to be seen as elite, and simply because there was no food or water to have in a way that would keep the population going. When we look at all these things, we have to realize to ourselves, wow, we have a pretty good track record of how things go. And in fact, Goldstone even gives us a set of formulas to determine, based on wages, based on population, based on education, as how political pressure continues to mount, that eventually something has to give. We're familiar with how political ratchets and grifts work here. We know that in our democratic system, that every election is a political release valve. Every election is a cold civil war in which we want to leverage all forces imaginable against our enemies, but because it's not really cool for me to bash my enemy's skull in anymore, that I guess I'll have to go to the ballot box and hope that that feels the same way. It doesn't, and I think anyone who's ever voted or participated in politics knows exactly how that feels, especially if you've worked in party politics, because then you know how cutthroat and gay it is. It really is, trust me. It's bad. Republican Party's the worst. But with all that being said, we have to sort of ask ourselves, well, what about now? It's 2025. Things are variously different. We have a new guy in office. We have our guy in office. We have a shit poster as the vice president of the United States. And most of your mutuals in here either work in the administration or work very closely with people who do. With that being said, you have to ask yourself, well, maybe we're in a better spot. Maybe we can delay this collapse. Maybe we can actually right the ship and the system. And I'm here to say simply this. As many as we have these stories about how the world is going to end, about how the dead will one day rise and the resurrection day will come and we will all be judged, and one day that day certainly will come, I don't know when. No man knoweth the hour. But with regards to our politics, we can look through the weeds all we want, but we are in a position, as we were asking earlier, that things might be different for us. And correct, we are. In 2025, we have more access to information. We have more access to books that have been banned. Thank you, Bagby, and the rest of those gentlemen here. But we also have the availability for us to communicate with one another and see on a ground level just how bad things are. With that, we have to realize, we have the opportunity to use our resources at every point of historical battle, at every point of political matchup, at every point in time where it seems like collapse is inevitable, and have an ability to map it ourselves. But as any good economist will tell you, that these are models, and models can easily be bullshit. I had a great professor in college who worked in the Reagan administration's Treasury Department, and he had said, listen, I can give you a model that says Medicare for all will one day solve the national debt crisis, but we both know that we're full of shit, aren't we? With that in mind, it's important for us to realize that we have to be grounded in reality when we talk about the end. We are more interconnected, we are more globalized than the ancient world, and we are more reliant on everyone else. The great debate about trade and international dependency causing war has been a debate in international relations circles for over 70 years. I think the best answer to that question comes from the Professor Dale C. Copeland, who says that it's not really the interdependency that matters, and in fact, it's the expectation about trade itself. When people feel like trade is going to decrease or our current relationship is going to somehow change from the status quo ante, then the likelihood of conflict, political or kinetic or otherwise, increases. It's this concern over trade anticipation that brings us to concerns today. You can see why the administration and those around us are pursuing some kind of changes to our trade policy, while the rest of the world realizes, things are not so different now, are they? As we try and change things, the concern over trade war, conflict, and our negotiation standing changes. As we realize now in the midst of these trade policies, we don't make things anymore now, do we? A good portion of our antibiotics come from China. A good portion of our industry now relies on manufactured goods from China and the Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. Anyone who works with federal contracting or works directly with the government or DoD knows that your procurement policies have certainly changed in the last 8 years. You can no longer use Chinese goods inside your systems. But with all this being said, are we going to have this war where this window opens up and we're fighting over Taiwan in 2027? Are we going to be out there just like we were dying for some strange country in the Middle East, like Qatar or something like that? Maybe. I'll have to ask Barry Weiss about that one. She's a real talker. But all of this tells us that we are so focused on what's going to happen next that we find ourselves in a bit of a paralysis of analysis. And I find that fitting, because for those in the Orthodox tradition, last Sunday was the feast of the Sunday of the Paralytic during this Paschal season. And, does thou wish to be made whole? Take up thy bed and walk. We have an opportunity to take up our beds. We have the opportunity to get up and walk, and rather than be paralyzed with analysis, we look so much towards the past, as we should, to understand what is going to come next. But we do live in a different time. We have great models, we have great literature, we have some of the greatest minds in this room right now, whether it's working in trade, economics, in government, procurement, land, government, municipalities, whatever, to tell you just how bad things are and where we're going to go and how bad things are going to be. But if I were in charge, here's how I can right the ship. Well, thankfully, we have that opportunity. That's why we're here. We are here, plain and simple, to discuss one simple thing. What is the road ahead? What is this organization going to do? Yes, we are young. Yes, we have been here not for a very long time, but the quality of people in here, especially from the previous years, shows me that there are guys in here that are dedicated to actually getting things done. That is something I have not seen in politics in my entire life. And I understand that I have not been on this earth for very long, but getting involved in politics since I was 16 years old working for the Republican Party, I'm a bit bittered wasting half my life wondering when is the next guy going to come in and actually fix shit. But all of you gentlemen in here have that possibility. Yes, it is very easy to be embittered. Anyone who is older than me and has worked in politics for any length of time has every reason to say, well, this is all bullshit, just like Dave said last night. These people don't want to get anything done. They want to talk about how great things used to be. And wouldn't it be nice if we could go back to those good old-fashioned family values on which we used to rely? Those days are probably behind us. That does not mean that we can bring them into the future. A politics of futures past, as Charles Haywood likes to describe, perfectly provides us with this moment. But this brings me back to Theodore Judson and his great works. While he's best known for a variety of novels and some unpublished works, one of my favorite things that I was introduced to, courtesy of Mr. Christopher Sandbach in the back, was that around 2009 or so, Judson ran a very small blog. And in that, as depressing as it really was, as any sort of like doomer boomer would be, he had described our desire to know the future. And Judson writes the following: "We always look towards the future because we have replaced God in our society about who is in control. We always look towards these great fictions as guides as to what the future will be. We are taught in George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World that these will be the manuals that we are taught in every public school class in English literature about when things go bad, this is what they'll look like. Quite frankly, those books are the worst ones to use," he continues, explaining that it's not going to be what they teach you. It's going to be what you see around you. But the moment we stop looking towards our fictions, the moment we stop looking at our, writers and our historians and our economists about how bad things can get, we suddenly realize that we have lost faith in the modern world, that man is truly not in control of his own actions, that there are greater forces at play beyond us, and that spiritual warfare, ladies and gentlemen, regardless of your belief, is very, very real. Judson concludes on that little blog post describing how we live in a society that is so determined to know the future that the moment we stop doing that, we have a crisis of faith, identity, and meaning in a way that we have not seen since the crisis of confidence in the age of the Enlightenment in relationship to those in the clerical classes during the 19th and 18th centuries. Ladies and gentlemen, we can look towards these great writers all we want. And in fact, I'm here to encourage you to do so. Understanding writers like Spangler, like Toynbee, like Tainter, like Gladstone, and others, including Judson, are vital for us to have an understanding of what the public consciousness was at that time and how to understand how they saw the world to come around us. The hour of decision certainly came and went, but that does not mean that another hour will come again. We are here to talk about the road ahead. We are here to look about how do we navigate a system that is indeed collapsing. Will it be like Judson? Will it be like 40K? Will we enjoy reclaiming England to save them from themselves one day? God, I hope so. But I do not know what the future lies ahead for us. None of us in this room do. We rely on each other and the analysis around us that we can provide, whether it's talking to all of the people that you hear on your favorite podcasts or reading the books that everyone in here has told us to read as sort of this great reactionary canon, and you should continue to do so. But the future has not yet been written. The future is written by people who are willing to act. No one had expected that in the past, especially in the 20th century, that obscure men with little to no background coming from nothing would somehow be at the forefront of the greatest political changes, conflicts, and policies that would alter the course of the 20th century. Had it not been the idea that all of a sudden the Kaiser should deliver the message rather by horseback and by carriage and rather than by a telegram, the June crisis of 1914 might have been averted, as Sean McMeekin tells us. But instead, by taking too long, the Russians realized that they had to act, so did the French, Serbia was invaded, and the opportunity for peace to destroy us from the great European Civil War had already come to a close. The die was already cast by one simple decision of being regal and not using a faster form of communication. We live in an age of instantaneous communication that wishes to dimensionalize us, cut us down into little bits and pieces so we can be tracked, put on algorithms, and have our insecurities boosted by the very advertisements, forms of dialogue, by powers that be far greater than we can understand, all hiding in shadowy cabinets, glowing like the glowies they are. But, ladies and gentlemen, thankfully we live in an age where we can kind of see past that. As Dave had remarked, it is all bullshit. But, with that being said, do not allow yourselves to read one text, to read one understanding, one piece of analysis and understand things are over, there is nothing that we can do, and that this is simply the end. And I will be like Diocletian, and I will raise my cabbages, and I will not come back for anything. For I have already foregone conclusion, the world has already ended, and I would like to simply be at peace. I don't think that we should be doing that at all. And the fact that you are all here tells me that you do not want to be doing that either. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, keep those ideas in your mind about how collapses happen. Understand that, yes, we have complex systems, a competency crisis, and a lot of idiots who shouldn't even be running the DMV, running vast swaths of the federal government, as well as municipalities all across the country and the Western world. Yes, it's basic truth. Everything that we know to be real is in fact very real. Everything that we know is true is true. As Orrin McIntyre likes to say, it's not rocket science. They just hate you and want you dead. But you know this already. You have read the books already. And if you haven't, well, I've given you a great list of titles for you to read and hopefully purchase from Bagby and others and this afternoon. But all of that allows us to come to one foregone conclusion. We do not know what the road ahead has because we have simply not taken the steps necessary to go on that road. That is why we are here. That is why we stand in this group of people today, talking about everything from infrastructure, government funding, finance, the rule of law, policing, municipalities, the economy, and of course, the political theology that rules our day. A lot of these mythologies of the 20th century are crumbling and falling away. While it might be eschatologically catastrophic for our liberal and progressive friends out there, we are all here smiling because we know that the road ahead is generated by men of action. And God willing, you will be those men of action, that you may not be recorded by history, but you will be part of the cadre of men that allowed things to actually happen. We do not have to trust what has been put in front of us sometimes for how the world may end. But we do know, as Judson writes, that that crisis of faith in meaning, in rationality, and the Enlightenment is slowly crashing down. He wrote that in 2009. We look at ourselves now in 2025, and we realize how many shibboleths and how many idols of the progressive and modern age have already begun to fallen away. The idea that we would somehow have a government that says the words anti-white in their policy is beyond anything that anyone would have imagined just 20 or even 8 years ago. Hell, I mean, who would have thought that someone would give a man $500 and say, please give that to Shiloh Hendricks for me? You, gentlemen, are going to be men of action. We may not be the great men of history. We may not be the ones who have statues and idols given to us with days of honors and remembrance, but we will be the ones that understand that whatever the road ahead lies for us, we will be the ones, bravely with our knowledge, taking our side, our books, and going out into the wilderness and the unknown ahead, and realizing and understanding that we are the ones that are forging the path forward. And with that, I hope that this organization and every single one of you in this room will be part of it. And God willing, I will see you on the other side, whatever the future may hold. Thank you.